At 70, when most voices have already learned to fade quietly into memory, Jimmy Fortune still steps into the light and sings like a man who is not trying to prove anything, only trying to survive the moment with honesty. People see the soft-spoken, humble performer, the steady faith, the gentle smile, and they assume the story is simple, a life blessed by music and rewarded with applause. But the truth is that the applause is only the surface, and underneath, it is a life built on pressure that never fully let go. The pressure of coming from nothing, the pressure of holding a family together while the road keeps calling, the pressure of standing in a place that once belonged to someone else, and the pressure of waking up one day and realizing your own body has been keeping secrets from you. The part that hits hardest is that none of it arrived in one dramatic explosion. It arrived like quiet damage, piling up year after year until the man on stage is no longer just a singer, he is a witness to everything he has endured. He was born on March 11th, 1955, and grew up in Virginia with faith and music as the rare constants. But childhood was not a peaceful hymn. It was a home where addiction could change the temperature of a room, where a child learned silence not because he was timid, but because silence kept things from getting worse. He has spoken about his father being an alcoholic, about the chaos that could show up before the words did, about a mother fighting a battle she could not always win. And when you understand that, you understand why music was never a hobby for him. It was a place to hide without running away, a place to breathe without being questioned. As a boy, he found a broken guitar with only 2 strings and played it anyway, not to sound good, but to feel better, and later when a real guitar finally landed in his hands, it felt like permission to dream even when the adults around him could not imagine music as a living. Years passed with no spotlight, no shortcuts, just work by day, small rooms by night, singing while people talked over him, driving home on dark roads, asking himself if his voice meant anything at all. Then in 1982, one night changed the direction of his life, not because the crowd suddenly noticed him, but because one listener did. Lou DeWitt, the tenor of the Statler Brothers, heard something in Jimmy that made him speak a sentence that felt like a door opening. DeWitt was struggling with Crohn's disease. The future was uncertain, and the group needed a voice that could hold the harmony together without tearing the past apart. Jimmy drove to Nashville, auditioned, and by January 28th, 1982, he was on stage with them for the first time in Savannah, Georgia, and by August 1982, he became the permanent replacement when DeWitt could no longer return. That word replacement sounds simple until you live inside it, because it means you walk into someone else's legacy and you are judged before you even sing. You cannot be too similar because then you are accused of imitation, and you cannot be too different because then you are accused of ruining what people loved. Every show becomes an exam. Every note is measured against a memory, and even when the audience claps, you can still feel the distance in their caution. Jimmy survived that pressure, and more than that, he helped the group breathe again, writing songs that carried real emotion without begging for attention, songs that did not just fill time on an album, but held people in their own grief and longing. But the stage never protected him from life. It only taught him how to keep his face steady while everything behind it shifted. In February 2023, his body forced him to stop pretending time was unlimited. When he underwent quintuple bypass surgery on February 15, 2023, a moment that turns a strong voice into a quiet prayer, because no matter how many crowds you have faced, lying in an operating room makes you realize how alone the fight can feel. And then, just as recovery began to restore a fragile rhythm, the kind of loss that no career can soften arrived. His son, Lester James Jimmy Fortune Jr., died on October 15, 2024 at age 51, and there is nothing poetic about that, only the brutal truth that a parent is not built to bury a child. After that, people close to him noticed the change, not in headlines, but in the weight of his silence, in the way his voice sounded older than his years, in the way certain songs suddenly carried more than melody. This is why his story makes people cry, because it is not about fame, it is about endurance, about a man who keeps walking onto the stage with a heart that has been repaired and a grief that cannot be repaired, choosing to sing anyway, not because life has been kind, but because singing is how he keeps living. Becoming part of a legendary group did not feel like winning to Jimmy Fortune. It felt like stepping onto unstable ground and being told not to move. From the moment he officially joined the Statler Brothers, Jimmy understood that his position was unlike any other in country music. He was not the young discovery audiences had watched grow. He was not the original voice people had loved for decades. He was the man who arrived because someone else could no longer stay. Replacing Lou DeWitt was never framed as a celebration. It was framed as necessity. Lou's Crohn's disease made touring unbearable, and the group faced a future no one wanted to acknowledge. For audiences, Lou was not simply a singer. He was memory. His tenor voice was woven into weddings, funerals, long car rides, and living rooms across America. And Jimmy Fortune was asked to step into that space quietly, without disturbing the emotional furniture that had been arranged for years. Every night on stage became a test that never ended. Jimmy could feel in the room before he sang, the way some people folded their arms, the way others leaned forward, listening not to enjoy the music, but to judge whether the new voice belonged. If he sang too much like Lou, he was accused of imitation. If he sang differently, people said something felt wrong. There was no version of perfection, only survival. That pressure followed him everywhere. It didn't disappear when the lights went down. It waited in hotel rooms at 2 a.m. It sat beside him on the tour bus while others slept. It hovered during phone calls home, when he didn't know how to explain that he was living inside applause and still felt completely alone. Jimmy learned quickly that being accepted on stage did not mean being accepted in memory. And yet, he stayed. Instead of trying to dominate the spotlight, Jimmy did something quieter. He began to write. Late at night, when the band harmonies stopped ringing in his ears, he sat alone with a guitar and turned inward. Songwriting became the only place where comparison could not reach him. There, he did not have to replace anyone. He could simply exist. In 1983, one of those late-night songs took shape. It was called Elizabeth. It was not written to chase charts or reshape the group's image. It felt more like a letter of gratitude, especially toward Lou DeWitt, whom Jimmy never referred to as the man he replaced, only the man who gave him a place to stand. When Elizabeth reached radio, it didn't explode. It moved slowly, quietly, almost politely, until one morning the band realized they were back at #1 on the Billboard charts. There was no celebration, just silence. The kind of silence that tells you something fragile has survived. More songs followed. My Only Love arrived during a period when Jimmy's personal life was quietly unraveling, though the stage revealed nothing. Then came Too Much on My Heart, a song that finally admitted what Jimmy had been carrying for years. These songs did more than revive the Statler Brothers' chart presence. They restored trust. Not trust in a new voice, but trust that the group was still alive. By the late 1980s and through the 1990s, the Statler Brothers returned fully to the road. Venues filled faster. Tickets sold earlier. Audiences sang along from the first note, not out of nostalgia alone, but because the harmonies still meant something. For many fans, the fear that the group would quietly disappear had passed. Behind the scenes, however, time was beginning to speak more clearly. For men had shared microphones, buses, and routines for decades. They were no longer chasing relevance or fighting for space. They were asking a different question, one few artists dare to face honestly. When is the right moment to leave before the stage decides for you? There was no dramatic announcement. No single meeting where everything changed. The decision to stop came slowly, scattered across backstage conversations and quiet evenings after shows. They didn't want to fade into exhaustion. They wanted to close the chapter intact, with voices still steady and respect still mutual. In October 2002, after a farewell tour that felt more like a long goodbye than a victory lap, the Statler Brothers stepped off the stage for the final time. Four men stood together, sang the songs that had followed them for a lifetime, and walked away without spectacle. For Jimmy Fortune, that moment carried a different weight. He had spent 20 years inside a harmony that was never truly his to own. He had written songs that kept the group breathing, stood where he was needed, and accepted that his name would always follow the band's name, never replace it. When the curtain closed, he was faced with a question that had been delayed for decades. If I am no longer the tenor voice of the Statler Brothers, who am I? Jimmy did not answer that question with ambition. He answered it with patience. His solo career began quietly in 2003 with the album When One Door Closes. It did not try to outrun the past. It acknowledged it. The music still carried country and gospel roots, but now his voice stood alone, exposed, without the safety of harmony. That exposure changed everything. For the first time, Jimmy was not measured against memory. He was measured against himself. The albums that followed did not promise reinvention. Titles like I Believe, Windows, and Lessons felt more like personal markers than commercial statements. His music became slower, more reflective, focused on faith, family, and questions that did not demand answers. He was no longer singing to hold a legacy together. He was singing to stay connected to life itself. And then, through his partnership with the Gaither Music Group, Jimmy found a different kind of audience, one that listened not for perfection, but for comfort. Churches, small gatherings, quiet rooms where music mattered because pain was present. There, his voice finally rested. Jimmy Fortune had spent his life learning how to stand in the right place without asking for more space. And now, for the first time, he was learning how to stand alone. But life had not finished testing him yet. Long before illness or public loss entered Jimmy Fortune's life, there was another kind of damage quietly taking shape, one that never appeared in headlines and never showed on stage. It lived at home, in the spaces between tours, in the years when applause came easily but presence did not. For Jimmy Fortune, success arrived early in one area of life and painfully late in another, and the imbalance followed him for decades. Jimmy married for the first time at just 17 years old. At an age when most people are still discovering who they are, he stepped directly into adulthood as a husband and soon after as a father. There was no scandal in that decision, only youth and optimism, and a belief that responsibility itself would somehow teach him how to be ready. But reality moved faster than maturity. A young family requires stability, routine, and emotional availability. Music, especially at the beginning, offers none of those things. In those early years, Jimmy was not a man with a career. He was a man with a hope. Nights were spent singing in small venues that barely paid enough to justify the gas it took to get there. Days were filled with work that kept food on the table, but did nothing to shorten the distance between where he was and where he dreamed of being. That tension created cracks no one knew how to seal. Love existed, but love alone could not compensate for exhaustion, uncertainty, and the absence that music demanded even before it paid back anything in return. Looking back later, Jimmy never blamed that first marriage on malice or betrayal. He blamed it on timing, on stepping into roles that required steadiness before he had learned how to stand still himself. The marriage ended, leaving behind a quiet guilt that followed him into the next chapter of his life. Not the guilt of a villain, but the guilt of someone who tried and still fell short. His second marriage came as his musical path began to open wider, right as his involvement with the Statler Brothers was taking shape. From the outside, it looked like progress. From the inside, it felt eerily familiar. Tour schedules grew heavier. Time at home became shorter. Presence was replaced by phone calls and promises to make it up later. There was no explosion, no dramatic ending. Only two people gradually moving out of rhythm with each other until there was nothing left to synchronize. By the time the second marriage ended, Jimmy Fortune was no longer a struggling unknown. He was a man standing on major stages, writing #1 songs, and carrying the weight of public success alongside private failure. 2 marriages behind him, children growing up in pieces of his life rather than the whole of it, and a growing realization that winning professionally does not protect you from losing personally. Jimmy did not talk about these things publicly. He did not turn them into interviews or confessionals. But his music slowed. The tone deepened. Songs began to sound like they were holding more than they revealed. While audiences heard harmony and reassurance, Jimmy was learning how to live with the feeling that parts of his life had moved forward without him. Everything shifted in 1998, not through a dramatic encounter, but through calm. Her name was Nina. She did not enter his life through the music industry or through the orbit of fame. She arrived during a period when Jimmy was already tired of running, even if he had not yet admitted it. Their connection did not begin with questions about tours or stages. It began with ordinary concern, whether he had eaten, whether he was resting, whether he was actually present. That simplicity unsettled him. After years of being defined by movement, someone finally offered stillness. When Jimmy later described what drew him to her, he said something revealing. With her, he no longer felt like he had to go anywhere. That sentence said more about his life than any chart position ever could. They married on October 1998. There was no spotlight, no attempt to reshape his public image. It was a decision rooted in exhaustion and clarity rather than excitement. After that, subtle changes appeared. Jimmy no longer accepted tour dates automatically. He paused. He considered what each trip would cost, not just financially, but emotionally. The pace of his life slowed in ways few fans would notice, but the difference was real. His family life at that point was complex. 7 children across different chapters of his life, assembled not by design, but by survival. It was not a picture-perfect narrative, and Jimmy never pretended it was. What mattered was not how it looked, but how it functioned. Meals together when possible. Quiet evenings after shows. Learning how to stay instead of always leaving. For the first time, his life began to feel balanced rather than managed. Then his body began to speak. At first, the signs were easy to dismiss. Fatigue that lingered longer than usual. Shortness of breath that came and went. A heaviness he attributed to age and years on the road. Jimmy had spent a lifetime pushing through discomfort. He had no reason to believe this was different. Until it was. Medical tests revealed what his instincts could no longer deny. Multiple coronary arteries were severely blocked, some nearly completely. His heart had been working under strain for years without warning him loudly enough to listen. There was no room for delay. On February 15, 2023, Jimmy Fortune underwent quintuple bypass surgery. For a man who had lived his life in motion, the stillness of recovery was unfamiliar and frightening. Shows were canceled, schedules erased. Days were reduced to slow steps, shallow breaths, and a steady hum of uncertainty. Faith, which had always guided him quietly, was no longer a concept or a song lyric. It became a habit, something he held onto without explanation, without bargaining. He later said he did not ask for anything dramatic, just enough strength to stay one more day. Recovery forced him to rethink everything. Not whether he would return to the stage, but how. Life was no longer measured by tours or albums, but by what his body and heart could bear. Nina stood beside him not as a caretaker, but as a rhythm. Meals, rest, pauses. Small decisions that replaced the relentless urgency of his earlier years. And then, just as his body began to stabilize, life delivered the kind of pain no preparation can soften. On October 15th, 2024, Jimmy's son, Lester James Fortune Jr., died suddenly at the age of 51. There was no warning, no gradual goodbye. One day his son existed. The next day he did not. Nothing in Jimmy Fortune's career prepared him for that moment. Not the pressure of replacement. Not the fear of illness. Not decades of public expectation. Losing a child is not an experience that teaches lessons or offers meaning. It simply breaks something fundamental. Those close to Jimmy noticed the change immediately. His voice grew heavier. Tempos slowed. Silence began to appear where words once lived. Jimmy did not turn that grief into a public narrative. He did not explain it or justify it. He carried it. Faith no longer offered answers. It offered endurance. He never said he understood the loss, only that he was learning how to keep living without understanding everything. At 70, Jimmy Fortune is no longer a man chasing relevance or recognition. He sings when his body allows. He steps on stage by choice, not obligation. Each performance carries the weight of survival, loss, and restraint. His life has not been defined by a single tragedy, but by the way hardship arrived repeatedly and quietly, and how he refused to let it take the rest of him. And still, he sings. After the loss of his son, Jimmy Fortune's life did not collapse in a way people expect from tragedy. There are no public breakdowns, no dramatic withdrawals from the world. What happened instead was quieter and in many ways harder to witness. Life continued, but it did so with a different gravity. Mornings arrived the same way they always had. Light coming through the window, familiar sounds outside. Yet everything felt heavier, as if the air itself required more effort to move through. The death of a child does not rearrange life all at once. It settles into it. It hides in routine. Jimmy found that grief did not scream. It whispered. It appeared in the pause before speaking, in the moments when a song felt too close to something he could not name. There were days when he picked up the guitar and put it back down without playing a note, not because the music was gone, but because silence felt more honest. For most of his life, Jimmy had used music as a way through hardship. Music carried him out of poverty. Music gave him refuge from chaos. Music offered structure when his personal life felt fractured. But this loss was different. There was no melody that could soften it, no lyric that could frame it in a way that made sense. And for the first time, Jimmy had to accept that some pain does not move forward. It stays. Those close to him noticed that his voice changed after his son's passing. It did not weaken, but it slowed. Notes lingered longer than before, as if he was allowing space for emotion instead of smoothing it over. On stage, he spoke less between songs. Where he once offered gentle stories, he now allowed quiet to sit in the room. Audiences did not always understand what they were feeling, only that something deeper was present. Faith, which had always been a steady companion in Jimmy's life, also changed form. In earlier years, faith had been a guide, a comfort, sometimes even a quiet source of optimism. After his son's death, it was no longer a place to look for answers. It became something far simpler: endurance. The ability to stand up each day and remain present without demanding explanations from a life that no longer offered them. Jimmy never spoke publicly about trying to understand why this happened. He never framed the loss as part of a larger plan. Instead, he spoke about learning how to live alongside it, about carrying grief without letting it consume everything else. That distinction mattered. It was not about overcoming. It was about coexistence. As his life slowed, so did his relationship with the stage. Performances became deliberate choices rather than obligations. He no longer filled calendars months in advance. He listened to his body, to his heart, to his emotional limits. Some nights he sang. Other nights he stayed home. That balance would have been unthinkable earlier in his career, when movement felt like survival. Now stillness had its own value. Financially, Jimmy no longer needed to prove anything. Decades of touring, songwriting, and steady work had given him security. But what mattered was not the number itself. It was what that security allowed him to do. He could say no. He could choose smaller venues. He could perform for rooms where people came to listen, not to relive nostalgia, but to feel something real. In this phase of his life, Jimmy did not position himself as a symbol or a spokesperson for grief. He did not attach his name to causes or campaigns. Instead, he let his presence speak quietly. When he sang songs about loss, they did not sound instructional. They sounded lived in. People who were hurting recognized themselves in that restraint. He continued working with Brothers of the Heart, standing alongside men of the same generation who no longer competed for space. There were no leading voices there, only harmonies shaped by time. These were not performances driven by ambition. They were gatherings of survival. Music became less about career and more about companionship. At home, life moved in modest rhythms. Meals together, conversations without urgency, shared silence that did not need to be filled. Jimmy had spent much of his earlier life in motion, measuring success by distance traveled and stages crossed. Now, success looked different. It looked like staying. like not leaving when things were hard, like allowing grief to exist without turning away from it. There were moments when the weight felt too heavy, anniversaries that arrived without warning, songs that suddenly felt impossible to finish. On those days, Jimmy did not force himself forward. He stepped back. He learned that stepping back was not quitting. It was listening. When a bronze statue of Jimmy Fortune was erected in his hometown, many expected him to treat it as a crowning achievement. Instead, he viewed it with a kind of quiet distance. To him, it did not represent victory. It represented endurance. A reminder of a road he had walked longer than he ever imagined he could. From a boy playing a broken guitar, to a man replacing a legend, to a father learning how to live after unimaginable loss. The statue did not freeze a moment of triumph. It marked the passage of time across a human life. And perhaps that was fitting. Jimmy had never chased moments meant to be frozen. He had moved through them, carrying what they gave and what they took. Today, Jimmy Fortune does not stand on stage as someone seeking recognition. He stands there as someone who has survived enough to understand that singing is not about being seen. It is about staying connected to life itself. His heart has been repaired by surgery. His life has been altered by grief. Neither returned him to who he once was. And yet, when he sings, there is no sense of retreat. There is presence. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. Jimmy's story, at this stage, is no longer about what happened to him. It is about how he chose to remain, how he allowed pain to change his pace without stealing his voice, how he learned that some wounds never close, but they can be carried with dignity. And as long as he continues to step onto the stage with that understanding, his journey does not end in tragedy. It continues in truth. By the time Jimmy Fortune entered his 70s, life no longer moved according to the rules that once governed his days. There were no relentless tour schedules dictating where he would wake up next. No pressure to stay visible simply to remain relevant. The urgency that once shaped his decisions had dissolved, replaced by something quieter and far more deliberate. What remained was not a man retreating from life, but one choosing carefully how to stay in it. For decades, Jimmy had lived by momentum. One show led to another. One album blurred into the next. Even grief, in earlier years, was something that had to wait its turn until the lights went down. But now, after illness and loss, momentum was no longer his anchor. Presence was. He began to understand that music did not need to dominate his life to remain meaningful. Instead of measuring success by the number of performances, he measured it by the honesty he could bring to each one. When he stepped onto a stage, it was no longer because the calendar demanded it, but because something inside him still wanted to speak. And when that desire was not there, he allowed himself to rest without guilt. This shift changed the way audiences experienced him. Those who came to see Jimmy Fortune in these later years did not come expecting perfection or nostalgia alone. They came knowing that what they would hear carried weight. His voice, shaped by decades of endurance, sounded less like a performance and more like a conversation. There were no unnecessary flourishes, no effort to impress, only songs delivered with the restraint of someone who understands that not everything needs to be emphasized to be felt. In this phase, Jimmy found a renewed sense of connection through his work with Brothers of the Heart. Standing alongside artists who had also traveled long roads, he returned to harmony without pressure. There were no roles to fight for, no hierarchy to maintain. Each voice existed where it belonged, shaped not by ambition, but by shared understanding. These performances felt less like concerts and more like reunions, moments where music served as a place to rest rather than a place to compete. Away from the stage, Jimmy's life settled into rhythms that once would have felt unfamiliar. Mornings without rushing, evenings without packing bags, conversations that were not interrupted by departure times. These were not dramatic changes, but they carried significance. For someone who had spent much of his life in transit, staying became an act of intention. He spoke less publicly during this time, not because he had nothing to say, but because he no longer felt the need to explain himself. Fame had taught him that words offered too quickly can lose their meaning. Silence, used carefully, could speak more honestly. When he did share, it was measured, thoughtful, grounded in experience rather than reflection. Financial stability played a role in this freedom. Years of consistent work had given Jimmy security, but he never treated that security as a trophy. He treated it as permission. Permission to decline opportunities that no longer aligned with his life. Permission to choose smaller spaces where listeners came to feel rather than to be entertained. Permission to live without the constant pressure to prove that he still belonged. This sense of sufficiency was not about comfort alone. It was about dignity. Jimmy Fortune had spent enough of his life being measured by comparisons, by charts, by expectations placed on him as a replacement, a songwriter, a survivor. Now, he measured himself differently, by how honestly he lived, by how gently he treated what remained fragile, by how faithfully he showed up for the people who mattered most. Grief continued to walk beside him, especially the loss of his son. It did not fade with time. It did not transform into something easier. It simply became part of his emotional landscape. Jimmy learned how to acknowledge it without letting it dominate every moment. Some days were heavier than others. Certain songs carried memories he could not always revisit. On those days, he stepped back, not as an act of surrender, but as an act of care. Music, in this context, became less about expression and more about companionship. When Jimmy sang now, he was not offering solutions. He was offering presence. People who had experienced their own losses recognized this immediately. They did not need him to explain pain. They needed to know they were not alone in carrying it. The industry around him continued to move at its usual pace, chasing the next voice, the next story, the next revival. Jimmy watched this from a distance, without bitterness or nostalgia. He understood that every generation must find its own sound. His work was no longer to lead, but to remain true to what he had lived. That clarity freed him from comparison in a way nothing else ever had. Recognition still arrived occasionally. Tributes, honors, quiet acknowledgments of a career built on consistency rather than spectacle. Jimmy received them with gratitude, but without attachment. Awards did not change the way he woke up in the morning. They did not ease grief or repair the body. What mattered more were the small moments. A listener sharing a story after a show, a harmony settling perfectly in a quiet room, the feeling that music still had a place in his life without demanding everything in return. At this stage, Jimmy Fortune's story was no longer driven by what happened to him, but by what he chose to protect. His health, his family, his emotional balance, his faith, no longer framed as certainty, but as endurance. He had learned that strength did not always look like perseverance at full speed. Sometimes it looked like slowing down enough to stay intact. What remained when the noise was gone was not emptiness. It was clarity, a life stripped of excess, centered on what could still be held with care. Jimmy did not see this as an ending. He saw it as a continuation, one shaped not by ambition, but by intention. And in that space, his voice found a different kind of power. Not the power to command attention, but the power to remain honest, even when life had taken more than it had given. As Jimmy Fortune moved deeper into his later years, something subtle but profound became clear. His life could no longer be measured by the same markers that once defined success. Charts, ticket sales, and packed schedules had lost their authority. What mattered now were smaller, quieter indicators. How his body felt when he woke up, whether his heart felt steady enough to sing, whether his spirit still recognized meaning in the act of stepping onto a stage. This shift did not happen overnight. It came gradually, shaped by illness, loss, and the long accumulation of experience. Jimmy had spent decades responding to external demands, living by deadlines and expectations that rarely paused long enough to ask how he was actually doing. Now, for the first time, he allowed himself to ask that question before committing to anything else. His relationship with music reflected this change. Singing was no longer a responsibility he owed to an audience or a career. It was a conversation he entered only when he felt present enough to do so honestly. Some performances felt strong and grounded. Others felt fragile, even uncertain. Jimmy learned to accept both without judgment. He understood that authenticity did not require consistency. It required truth. Audiences sensed this immediately. Those who came to see him during this period were not looking for spectacle. They were looking for connection. They recognized that the man standing before them was not performing a role. He was sharing a moment shaped by everything he had lived through. His voice carried age, not as decline, but as depth. Each pause, each breath, carried as much meaning as the notes themselves. In these moments, Jimmy no longer tried to hide vulnerability. He allowed it to exist naturally, without explanation. He did not frame his life as a story of triumph over hardship. He presented it as a story of coexistence with hardship. That honesty created space for listeners to reflect on their own lives, their own losses, their own unfinished questions. Outside of music, Jimmy's days became increasingly grounded in routine. There was comfort in predictability, something he had rarely known in his earlier years. Simple meals, familiar surroundings, conversations that did not have to end early. These were not dramatic changes, but they were deeply stabilizing. After a lifetime of movement, stillness became its own form of healing. Health remained a constant consideration. The heart surgery had left a permanent awareness of limitation. Jimmy listened closely to his body, respecting signs he once would have ignored. Fatigue was no longer something to push through. It was information. Pain was no longer an inconvenience. It was a boundary. Learning to live within those boundaries required patience, but it also brought clarity. Grief continued to shape his emotional world, particularly the loss of his son. Time did not resolve it. It only altered the way it showed up. Some days were manageable. Others carried an unexpected weight. Jimmy learned not to predict or control these shifts. He allowed them to come and go, trusting that acknowledging grief was healthier than resisting it. Faith played a quieter role than it once had. It was no longer expressed through certainty or explanation. It existed as a posture toward life. Acceptance without resignation. Hope without expectation. Jimmy did not speak often about belief, but those close to him recognized it in the way he lived. In the patience he showed himself. In the gentleness he extended to others. As recognition for his long career continued to arrive in modest forms, Jimmy received it with appreciation but without attachment. He understood that acknowledgement did not define his worth. It simply reflected the consistency with which he had shown up over the years. What mattered more was knowing that his work had accompanied people through moments that mattered to them. Weddings, funerals, long drives, quiet evenings. Music had been present where words often failed. Jimmy Fortune never positioned himself as an example to be followed. He did not present lessons or formulas for living well. His life offered something less prescriptive and more human. It showed that survival does not always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like continuing carefully without demanding that pain transform into meaning. In conversations with friends, Jimmy often spoke about gratitude, but not in a performative way. Gratitude did not erase what had been lost. It simply acknowledged what remained. The ability to sing, the ability to feel, the ability to choose how to spend his time. These are not guarantees. They were gifts that could not be taken for granted. At this stage, Jimmy no longer chased a sense of completion. He understood that life does not resolve itself neatly. There are no final answers, no perfect balance. What exists instead is an ongoing negotiation between what has been endured and what can still be embraced. He approached this negotiation with humility, aware that each day carried its own limits and possibilities. What defined Jimmy Fortune now was not endurance alone, but discernment, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to step forward and when to rest, when to sing and when to let the room breathe. These choices shaped a life that felt intentional rather than reactive. And in that quiet measure, his story continued. not as a comeback, not as a farewell, but as a steady presence. A voice that had learned how to live alongside its own history, carrying what could not be fixed without letting it erase what could still be lived. At this point in his life, Jimmy Fortune no longer measures time the way he once did. Years no longer feel like steps towards something bigger. They feel like space to breathe, to remember, to decide whether today is a day for singing or for quiet. And in that space, something important has settled. He is no longer trying to become anything else. He is simply being who he is. For most of his life, Jimmy stood in places shaped by expectation. First, the expectation to escape a difficult childhood without breaking. Then, the expectation to fill the space left by a legend. Later, the expectation to remain strong while personal losses quietly accumulated. Each stage required endurance. Each demanded restraint. And for a long time, he believed that staying upright was the same as staying whole. Only later did he learn the difference. Now, when Jimmy steps onto a stage, he does so without armor. The voice that rises is no longer protected by ambition or urgency. It carries its history openly. The audience may not know every detail. Heart surgery, failed marriages, the loss of a son. But they hear something that cannot be hidden. A voice that has learned how to live with damage rather than erase it. There is a calmness in the way he performs now. Not the calm of someone untouched, but the calm of someone who has survived enough to stop running. He does not rush songs. He allows silences to exist without filling them. He trusts the room. He trusts himself. These are not techniques learned from years in the industry. They are habits shaped by experience. People often describe Jimmy Fortune as humble, but humility does not fully capture what he embodies. What defines him now is acceptance. Acceptance that some chapters cannot be rewritten. Acceptance that pain does not need justification. Acceptance that life does not owe explanations for what it takes away. This acceptance does not weaken him. It steadies him. In his quieter moments, Jimmy reflects on how unlikely his journey truly was. A boy from a small town, playing a broken guitar with 2 strings. A young man singing in rooms where no one listened. A replacement voice walking into a legacy that could have crushed him. A survivor of illness that could have ended everything. A father learning how to live after the kind of loss that never heals. None of it followed a straight line. None of it promised security. And yet, here he is. Jimmy does not speak of legacy in grand terms. He does not talk about being remembered. If there is something he hopes remains, it is simpler than that. He hopes his music made people feel less alone. He hopes his voice offered comfort when words were not enough. He hopes that by staying honest, even in silence, he allowed others to recognize their own pain without shame. That hope shapes how he lives now. He chooses performances carefully. He values sincerity over scale. He understands that smaller rooms can hold deeper truths. When people approach him after shows, they rarely talk about chart positions or awards. They talk about moments, about songs that helped them through grief, about harmonies that carried them through nights when sleep would not come. Jimmy listens more than he speaks. He knows those moments matter more than applause. At home, life continues quietly, not without sadness, but without chaos. Jimmy has learned how to remain present even when memories surface without warning. He does not push them away. He acknowledges them and continues. This, more than anything, defines his strength. Not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain take everything else with it. Faith remains part of his life, but it no longer asks to be explained. It exists in daily practice rather than declaration, in gratitude without denial, in endurance without bitterness, in the choice to keep going without demanding clarity. Jimmy understands now that faith does not always bring comfort. Sometimes it simply offers permission to continue. As the world around him moves on, new voices, new stories, new cycles of fame, Jimmy Fortune remains slightly apart from it all. Not disconnected, but no longer dependent. He has reached a place where his worth is no longer tied to visibility, where silence is not something to fear, where rest is not something to earn. This does not mean his journey is finished. It means it is no longer rushed. When Jimmy sings today, there is no sense of return or farewell. There is only continuation. A man with a heart that has been repaired, carrying losses that cannot be repaired, choosing to sing anyway. Not to prove resilience, not to inspire, but because singing is how he stays connected to life. And as long as that voice continues to rise, steady, worn, honest, his story does not end in tragedy. It ends again and again in presence.